The thing about the 7th Armada is that nobody in the Kale Reach had ever seen it grounded before. I mean that literally. In 22 years of continuous patrol, the 7th Armada had never gone dark in a transit berth, never sat idle in a repair dock, never asked anyone for anything. They came through the Reach twice a year on rotation, their ships so clean and so cold-lit you could mistake them for architecture. 14 capital vessels, the flagship Vethani Sarath at the front of the column like a moving cliff face, and not once in living memory had any of them so much as limped. The dockworkers at Kale Reach Transit Station used to joke about it, used to say the Vethani warships were too proud to break down, that even the drive corps had dress uniforms they wore when they came through. I was not a dockworker at Kale Reach Transit Station. I was a civilian mechanic with a bay lease and a 3-year backlog of freight hauler work, and absolutely no reason to care what the Vethani Armada did or did not do with its flagship. My name is Rail Voss. I have been fixing drive corps since I was 26 years old. Not warship drive corps. I want to be clear about that up front, because the distinction mattered enormously to a lot of people for a lot of reasons that I will get to shortly. Freight corps. The big, ugly, civilian-grade traction engines that push grain haulers and ore barges and livestock transports across the lanes between here and the outer rim colonies. They are not glamorous machines. They run hot and they run dirty, and they are, as a class of drive system, treated roughly and maintained irregularly by owners who are more interested in whether the cargo gets there than in whether the core sounds happy. What they are, at their best, is honest. They tell you what is wrong with them in a fairly direct way if you have spent enough years learning their language. I had spent 12 years learning their language. Those 12 years had taken me to 11 different transit stations across the Reach, which sounds like an interesting life, and is, in practice, a life spent mostly in low-ceilinged spaces smelling of solvent. I had started at Veldorath's freight tier as an apprentice under an old Vethani civilian named Korath, who had been fixing cores since before I was born, and who had a theory that every machine failure is at its root a failure of attention. Someone at some point had stopped paying attention to the thing that was slowly going wrong, and the job of a good mechanic was to reverse that, to pay attention until you understood what had been missed. He had been a good teacher in the way that difficult people are sometimes good teachers, which is to say, he had given me very little patience and a very high standard, and the deep conviction that finding the real problem was more important than fixing the obvious symptom. I had taken that conviction and 12 years of practice to Kale Reach, and I had been there for 3 years now, and my reputation had grown to the point where I had a backlog and could afford to take only the cases that interested me. My bay was in the civilian side of Kale Reach's Tier 2 deck, a long, low-ceilinged space that smelled permanently of solvent and warm metal, and the particular burnt-sweet odor that thermal coupling compound gives off when you're cutting it away from a housing that's been running too hot for too long. I had 6 bays total under my lease, and on the morning the 7th Armada came in, I had 5 of them occupied. A grain hauler with a cracked mounting played on its number 3 traction ring, a livestock transport with a coolant line bundle that had been spliced so many times the original routing was a fiction, a small ore barge whose owner had tried to repair his own field dampener, and had made a thorough job of making it worse, and 2 medium-haul freighters whose owners had booked me 6 months in advance, because word had gotten around that I was good at finding the thing nobody else could find. I was elbow-deep in the coolant line bundle on the livestock transport when the Armada came in. I heard it before I saw it. You felt it first, actually, a deep harmonic pressure change in the deck that meant something very large was maneuvering nearby. And then the general comm chimed and said something about the 7th Armada requesting priority berth access in Dock 7, and several of my bay apprentices stopped what they were doing to drift toward the observation windows that faced the main docking face. I did not go to the observation windows. I had a coolant line splice in my hand, and a list of 47 other things wrong with that livestock transport's routing bundle, and I was not going to stand at a window watching warships park. I heard about the fault 3 hours later from Orvith, who ran the dock supply counter 2 bays down from mine, and who knew everything that happened at Kale Reach within 30 minutes of it happening. "Flagship's grounded," Orvith said, leaning on my bay door with a cup of something hot in each hand, offering me one. I took it. "Drive fault on the tertiary core bank. Won't restart." "That's their problem," I said. "It's been 3 hours, and their engineering team is already asking the station for tool access." "Also their problem." Orvith looked at me in the way he sometimes did when he thought I was being unnecessarily terse, which was most of the time. He was a big, pale green Vethani himself, civilian caste, which was a different category entirely from military caste in ways I had only partially mapped in the years I had been at the Reach. And he had a quality of patient amusement toward my bluntness that I had come to appreciate. "You know what's wrong with it," he said. It was not a question. "I haven't been within 400 meters of it." "You know anyway." I drank the hot drink. It was bitter and faintly medicinal, the way Vethani tonic always was, and I had acquired a taste for it over the years the way you acquire a taste for anything you consume in large quantities in a place you've decided to stay. "I have no idea what's wrong with a Vethani military drive core," I said. "I have never worked on a Vethani military drive core. I work on freight cores." "The tertiary bank on the Sarath was refitted at Vel Dorath Station 14 months ago," Orvith said, "using surplus civilian-grade coupler housing from the Dorath orbital stockpile. Budget refit. Somebody in naval procurement approved it because the military coupler housings were backordered." I looked at him. He looked back at me, still with that quality of patient amusement. "You heard me," he said. I thought about the grain hauler I had not finished yet, and the coolant line bundle, and the 47 items on the livestock transport's defect list. I thought about the ore barge owner who had tried to fix his own field dampener, and had instead created something that I was privately referring to in my head as the field dampener incident. "I'm busy," I said. "I know," Orvith said. "I'm just telling you what I heard." He went back to his supply counter. I went back to the coolant line bundle. I did not think about the Vethani Sarath for the rest of the day, or if I did, I thought about it the way you think about something that has nothing to do with you. The next morning the station general comm announced that the 7th Armada was temporarily delaying its patrol rotation pending resolution of a drive system fault. I heard the same announcement the morning after that, which was the second full day the flagship sat in Dock 7, with 14 of the most decorated military engineers in the Vethani fleet standing around its tertiary core bank, and not knowing what to do about it. On the afternoon of the second day, Orvith told me that the engineering team had completed a full physical disassembly of the tertiary coupling array, 18 hours of work, and had then reassembled everything correctly and found themselves exactly where they'd started. He told me this in the same tone he used for everything, which was the tone of a man reporting facts about the weather. "They didn't find it," I said. "They didn't find it," he agreed. "What does their diagnostic say?" "Catastrophic thermal fault in the core coupler stack. Protection shutdown won't clear." I thought about this. A thermal fault diagnosis on a core that has been fully disassembled and found physically intact means the diagnostic is wrong about what it thinks it's seeing, which means the sensor is lying, which means you need to stop trusting the diagnostic and start trusting your hands and your eyes. This is a thing that freight core mechanics learn to do early, because freight cores are repaired in the field by owners who don't have diagnostic equipment and sometimes don't even have the right tools. And if you've spent enough time cleaning up the aftermath of field repairs, you learn that the machine's physical reality is always more reliable than any instrument's interpretation of it. I did not say any of this to Orvith. I went back to the coolant line bundle on the livestock transport. I know what those 2 days cost Admiral Sorval Keth because he told me later. Not in the way a man makes a confession. He was not that kind of man. But in the flat, precise way a military commander reviews the operational record. 14 engineers, 2 of whom had individually received the Vethani Fleet Engineering Medal, which I gathered was a significant thing. 3 full diagnostic cycles using military standard core modeling equipment. 1 complete physical disassembly and reassembly of the tertiary coupling array, which took 18 hours and accomplished nothing except confirming that all the components were present and appeared to be undamaged. 3 requests to the Vethani Naval Engineering Bureau for remote consultation, the last of which had prompted the Bureau to suggest that the fault might be a software corruption in the Corps' management system, a conclusion that Admiral Keth's chief engineer, a quietly precise woman named Verath San, had told him was wrong. She had been right that it was wrong. She did not yet know what right looked like. I learned most of this afterward. At the time, on the morning of the 3rd day, all I knew was what Orvith told me when he brought the tonic again. They've disassembled and reassembled the whole coupling array, he said, twice. Good for them. Still won't restart. I put down the torque driver I was holding. I was in the middle of the grain hauler's mounting plate repair, which was not an interesting problem but was a thorough one, and I had been looking forward to finishing it before lunch. What are you suggesting, Orvith? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you what's happening. You've been not suggesting things to me for 3 days. He shrugged, which on a Vethani civilian looks like a very slow roll of the shoulders, like a stone settling. I know you're busy. I am busy. I have 6 bays and 40-something items on 3 separate defect lists, and 2 owners who are going to be calling me before the end of the week to ask why their ships aren't ready yet. The Armada has been grounded for 3 days, Orvith said. The patrol rotation is 58 hours overdue. There are 16 supply convoys waiting on Armada escort to begin their runs to the outer rim colonies. If those convoys are delayed more than another 48 hours, the winter cycle food shipments to Vel Sarath and 3 adjacent colony stations will miss their distribution window. I looked at him for a long moment. That's not my responsibility, I said. No, Orvith said pleasantly. It's the 7th Armada's responsibility, and the 14 engineers who can't fix it. He went back to his supply counter. I stood there with the torque driver in my hand for what was probably 90 seconds, which felt longer, and then I put the driver down on the parts tray, wiped my hands on the work rag, and walked out of my bay and down the corridor toward Dock 7. I made it about halfway. The dock access corridor to Dock 7 had a checkpoint on it, a standard naval security station, 2 uniformed Vethani military personnel, and a barrier gate that I could not pass without a military access credential, which I did not have. The younger of the 2 guards looked at me with the polite blankness that military personnel at checkpoints have perfected across every species I have ever encountered. This access corridor is restricted to authorized naval personnel and credentialed engineering contractors, ma'am. Can I help you? I'm a mechanic, I said. Civilian Bay Tier 2, I've heard you have a drive core fault on the Sarath. That is a restricted matter, ma'am. I work on freight cores. I heard the tertiary bank was refitted with civilian-grade coupler housing. I think I might know what your engineers are looking at wrong. The guard's expression did not change exactly, but something behind it did a flicker of something that was either interest or the strict suppression of it. He looked at the other guard, who made a small head movement that communicated nothing to me and apparently communicated everything to him. I'm not authorized to admit civilians to Dock 7, he said. If you'd like to submit a technical consultation request through the station's Naval Liaison Office. How long does that take? Typically 3 to 5 business days for review and... Thank you, I said and walked back to my bay. I went back to the grain hauler's mounting plate. The problem with mounting plates is that they are never just a mounting plate. By the time a mounting plate has cracked, it has done so because something upstream of it has been vibrating wrong for a long time, and finding the source of the vibration is almost always a longer job than replacing the plate itself. I spent the rest of the morning tracking the vibration source, which turned out to be a micro-imbalance in the number 2 traction ring stabilizer array. I noted it on the defect list, told the repair queue to flag it for the owner's approval, and then started on the ore barge and the field dampener incident, which was every bit as involving as I'd expected. It was late in the afternoon when Vereth-san found me. I did not know it was her at first. I knew it was a Vethani military officer. The uniform was unmistakable, even for someone who paid as little attention to the Vethani military's rank insignia as I did, a small, composed woman with the particular quality of stillness that I associated with people who are accustomed to thinking carefully before speaking. She stood at the entrance to my bay for a moment before she said anything, looking at the ore barge and the open field dampener housing with an expression that was not quite curiosity. "Are you Rail Voss?" she said. It was not really a question. "Yes. I'm Vereth-san, Chief Engineer Vasvethani Sarath." She paused. "You came to the Dock 7 checkpoint this morning." "I was turned away," I said. "I know. I reviewed the checkpoint log when one of the guards mentioned it." She looked at the field dampener housing again, then back at me. "You told the guard you thought you knew what the engineering team was looking at wrong." I said I might know. I still haven't seen it. "What made you think there was something to see?" I explained what Orvith had told me about the civilian-grade coupler housing. I explained it briefly, the way I would explain something to another mechanic. Not in the way you explain things to someone who needs convincing that the explanation matters, just in the way you lay out the facts and let the facts do the work. Vereth-san listened. She had a quality of listening that was thorough and gave nothing away, which I respected. "We've run full diagnostics on the coupler housing," she said when I was done. "Thermal profiles, stress mapping, the standard battery, everything reads within tolerance." "What tolerances?" I said. She looked at me. "Military coupler tolerances or civilian coupler tolerances," I said. "They're not the same. If the housing is civilian grade and you ran the diagnostic against military core parameters, you get a tolerance reading that looks fine for a military housing and is still technically degraded for the civilian spec." Vereth-san was quiet for a moment. It was a particular kind of quiet, not the quiet of not understanding, but the quiet of checking something internally and finding that you hadn't checked it before. That would require the diagnostic calibration to have been set to military core parameters as a default, she said. "Is that what the diagnostic does by default?" Another pause. "Yes," she said, "it does." We looked at each other. "I'd like you to come look at it," she said. "I tried," I said. "I was turned away." "I know, I'm asking you to try again. I'll meet you at the checkpoint." I thought about the ore barge. I thought about the field dampener and the 47 items and the 2 owners who were going to call me before the end of the week. I thought about 16 supply convoys and the winter cycle food shipments to Vel Sarath. "Give me 10 minutes to clean up," I said. I spent 7 of those 10 minutes at my parts bench, not cleaning up, thinking about what I'd said and whether it was right. The civilian coupler theory was not a certainty. It was a hypothesis built on second-hand information from a supply counter operator who had heard something from a dock worker who had heard it from someone else. It was the kind of hypothesis you form when you've seen a certain failure pattern enough times to recognize its shadow from a distance. 12 years of freight cores means you have seen a lot of shadows. The other 3 minutes I used to pull my tool roll from the locker and sling it over my shoulder. Inside it, I had everything I would need if I was right about what I was going to find. Vereth-san met me at the checkpoint as she'd said. The guard who had turned me away in the morning looked at her credentials and then at me, and there was a brief moment where his expression suggested he was recalibrating his understanding of how his day was going to proceed. He let me through without comment. Dock 7 was larger than my entire Tier 2 bay complex, which is saying something. The Vethani Sareth sat in the primary berth and took up most of it. A capital-class warship in dry berth is a different thing from a capital-class warship in space. In space, you only see the parts that are lit. In berth, you see everything. The full length of the hull plating, the landing strut assemblies, the access scaffolding, the open maintenance hatches, and the dense, complicated territory of the engineering bays along the lower hull section where the drive cores lived. The lower hull engineering bay on the Sareth was bigger than some buildings I'd worked in. Vareth-san walked me through it without commentary, which I appreciated. I could tell from the way the bay was laid out, and the tools and equipment still positioned around the tertiary core bank, that the engineering team had been working on it in sustained rotation. The kind of continuous coverage that means nobody has gone home and nobody has given up, but the pace of activity has gotten quieter over the days as the options run out. There were 6 engineers in the bay when we arrived. They stopped what they were doing, or what they were not quite doing, and looked at me. I had been looked at in that way before. It is a specific kind of look. It is not hostile exactly, though it has something in common with hostility. It is the look of people who are very good at what they do and who have not been able to do it, and who are now looking at someone who is being brought in to suggest that maybe the reason they haven't been able to do it is that they've been looking at it wrong. It combines professional pride, exhaustion, and the particular misery of a problem that has defeated you, and it is not a comfortable look to be on the receiving end of. I did not take it personally. I had been on the other side of that look enough times to understand it. The ones who gave you that look were almost always the ones who actually cared about getting it right. The ones who would be furious if you found the answer in 20 minutes, and then 5 minutes after the fury would be copying the solution into their own work logs with complete professional honesty. Engineers who don't give you that look are more comfortable to work around, but they're also the ones who leave things half-fixed. 2 of the 6, I noticed, had the same metal insignia on their uniforms, which I learned later was the Vethani Fleet Engineering Medal. The other 4 had the look of people who had been working without adequate sleep for approximately 2.5 days, which they had. One of them, a younger engineer, probably not more than 30 in human terms, met my eyes briefly and then looked away, which told me she was the one who was most willing to admit that something new might be needed. I noted her position in the bay without knowing exactly why. I looked at the tertiary core bank. The Vethani Military Drive Core is a piece of engineering that I will say, without reservation, is beautiful. Not in the way that a painting is beautiful, in the way that a well-designed machine is beautiful, meaning that you can see in its structure the thinking that went into it, the choices made and refined over generations of iteration. The military cores are precision instruments built to tight tolerances by people who care very much about the tolerances, and every component of the primary and secondary banks of the Sareth's tertiary section was exactly that. Precision military-grade work, clean and correctly seated and maintained to the standards you'd expect from a crew that had been flying this ship for years. The civilian-grade coupler housing on the tertiary bank was also easy to see, once I knew to look for it. It was not that it looked wrong exactly. It looked like everything around it, because it had been installed correctly and was the right shape and occupied the right position. But it was a different material, a slightly different surface texture, a fractionally different color tone in the thermal coating, and it was marked with the civilian spec stamp that I had been looking at on freight cores for 12 years, which looks different from the military spec stamp the same way that a freight hauler bolt looks different from a warship bolt, which is to say it looks almost identical unless you have spent a lot of time looking at both of them. Admiral Sorval Keth was in the bay. I had not noticed him when I walked in, which I mention only because it is unusual for me to not notice the most senior person in a room. He was standing against the far wall of the bay with two of his officers, and he was watching me in the way that senior commanders watch things. Completely still, face giving nothing away, entirely present. He was a large man by Vithani standards. They tend toward lean, and he was not lean, and he had the deep blue-black skin coloring that marked the higher military castes, with the long, faintly luminous silver striations along the jawline and collarbone that I later learned indicated a specific lineage of the Keth house, one of the older military families in the fleet's history. His eyes were the pale silver white of the higher caste Vithani, and they were fixed on me with an expression that was not welcoming. Varath San beside me was very still. The admiral crossed the bay. He did not hurry, which was its own statement. "Who authorized this?" he said. "Not to me, to Varath San." "I did," she said. "Chief Engineer's discretion, under the operational emergency protocol." "She is a civilian." "Yes." "She works on freight vessels." "Yes." The admiral looked at me. I looked back. I had not done anything wrong, and I did not intend to behave as though I had. "The tertiary bank was refitted with civilian-spec coupler housing," I said, because the conversation was going to get there eventually, and I saw no reason to delay it. The admiral's expression shifted. Not a lot. A very small recalibration, which on a face that was giving almost nothing away was more visible than it would have been on other faces. "Our diagnostics showed the housing within tolerance," he said. "Military tolerance," I said. "The civilian spec has a tighter thermal expansion coefficient. At operational temperature, the housing has warped by 2 to 3 thousandths. Not enough to show on a visual inspection. Not enough to throw a failure alert. Enough to cause the thermal sensor buried in the housing to read the coupler temperature incorrectly, because the sensor contact point has shifted. The core management system sees the sensor reading, decides the coupler is running 30 degrees hotter than it actually is, and shuts the tertiary bank down as a protective measure. The core isn't actually damaged. The sensor is lying." The bay was very quiet. One of the engineers made a small sound. I think it was involuntary. The admiral looked at me for a long moment. "You identified this from a physical inspection," he said. "I recognize the housing type," I said. "The rest is a standard failure mode on freight cores with poorly managed heat cycling. You'd see it on a civilian core after a hard run in cold transit lanes. The housing warps when it goes through a sharp thermal gradient without enough expansion time. The sensor shifts and starts lying. The management system believes the sensor. It's usually the first thing I check when a core reads a false overheat on the tertiary run." Another silence. "And if you're correct," Admiral Keth said, "what is the repair?" I opened my tool roll on the nearest parts bench. "You reseat the housing using a tapered draw pin to bring it back into true. Apply heat to the housing material to let it reform to its proper geometry. Verify the sensor contact point is back on its mark, and run a low-power calibration cycle to confirm the sensor is reading correctly. The core management system clears the protective shutdown when the sensor reads accurately." I found the draw pin and laid it on the bench beside the compact heat lamp from my kit. 2 hours, maybe less. The admiral looked at the draw pin. He looked at the heat lamp. They were modest-looking things. The draw pin was a graduated cylinder of hardened tool metal, tapered at one end and hex-socketed at the other. The kind of thing you could buy at any freight supply counter in the Reach for a few credits. The heat lamp was a battered thing I had owned for 6 years and had repaired twice. They did not look like the instruments that fixed flagships. "You're certain," he said. "I'm certain enough to be standing here," I said. I want to note, for the record, that he did not ask me any of the things I would have expected him to ask. He did not ask me for my credentials or my work history or my certification records. He did not ask Varath San to vouch for my methodology. He did not suggest that perhaps one of his own engineers should conduct the repair under my guidance, or that the work should be overseen by a senior naval technical officer, or any of the other reasonable things a person in his position might have suggested. He looked at the drop-in for another 2 or 3 seconds. Then he looked at Varath San. "Clear the bay to essential observation personnel," he said. "Give her what she needs." And he stepped back against the wall, crossed his arms, and watched. I appreciate this in retrospect. It was a clean decision by a man who knew how to make them. He had been wrong about something, or more precisely, his engineering program had been wrong about something in a way that had grounded his fleet for 3 days, and the path to being less wrong was now in front of him, and he took it. He did not require the path to look a particular way first. He did not require me to justify my existence in his bay or convince him of my competence with anything other than the work. He simply got out of the way and let me do it. Not everyone has the capacity to do that. I have worked for people who didn't, and I know the difference. I started with the inspection. I've explained the theory already: the warped housing, the shifted sensor contact, the false overheat reading, but theory and confirmed finding are different things, and I was not going to put a drop-in to a flagship's core coupler housing on a theory alone. I pulled my contact probe micrometer from the tool roll and began a point-by-point measurement of the housing surface at 8 mapped positions, working inward from the outer edge toward the sensor port. The measurements came back at 3 positions, a warp of between 2.4 and 2.9 thousandths of an inch from true, distributed across one face of the housing in a pattern consistent with a single hard thermal cycle. The kind of thing that happens when a ship runs a fast transit through a cold region of space without giving the core time to equalize. I noted the measurements in my work log. Varath San, who had stayed in the bay, came and looked over my shoulder at the readings without asking to. "A transit through the Vel Sareth cold lane," she said quietly. 8 days ago. We ran it faster than standard because of the escort schedule." "That would do it," I said. I checked the sensor contact point next. A small fiber optic probe, another freight bay standard, not a military instrument, inserted through the sensor access port, told me what I needed to know. The contact point had shifted 1.8 thousandths from its nominal position, which was inside the tolerance range for a military housing, and outside the tolerance range for the civilian spec housing that was actually installed. The sensor was reading a contact temperature that was notionally possible for the nominal contact position and was simply wrong for the actual position. The core management system had no way to know this. It was doing exactly what it was designed to do. "Ready," I said, and picked up the heat lamp. The heat lamp comes first. You cannot reseat a warped coupler housing cold. The material has to be brought back to the temperature range at which it formed, so that it can reform without cracking. The civilian spec housing material is softer than the military-grade equivalent, which is partly why it warped in the first place, and it is also partly why the reseating works. The same softness that made it vulnerable to the warp makes it responsive to correction. Military-grade housing would have required a machine press and a controlled oven. The civilian housing just needed a heat lamp, some patience, and someone who knew how long to hold it. I held it for 11 minutes. I have a reasonable sense of time, but I also have a small timer in my work log, and I used both. The bay was quiet enough that I could hear the soft hiss of the heat lamp and the faint metallic sound of the housing material beginning to respond to the temperature. Varath San watched, the admiral watched, the remaining engineers watched. Nobody spoke. There's something about the moment when a piece of metal begins to respond to heat that I have always found clarifying. It is not dramatic. The material does not glow or spark or make a sound that announces itself. It simply becomes marginally more cooperative, marginally more willing to be where you put it. You feel it through the tool rather than see it with your eyes. 12 years of this work means you feel it reliably. I picked up the drop-in. The reseating is a careful job, but not a complicated one, if you know the geometry. The tapered end of the drop-in goes into the access port at the housing edge. You apply measured pressure along the axis of the warp and draw the housing surface back into true while the material is still cooperative from the heat. You work in small increments, a few thousandths at a time, checking the surface at the mapped positions between passes until the measurements match the nominal geometry. It is slow because you cannot rush it, and it is quiet because there is nothing loud about it. The first pass brought 3 of the 8 positions back inside civilian spec tolerance. The second pass brought 5. The third pass brought all 8 to within half a thousandth of true, which was better than the housing had probably been even before the transit that warped it. I ran the micrometer over all 8 positions again and wrote down the numbers. "Contact point," I said to Verath San, and she produced the fiber optic probe from where she'd set it down and handed it back to me without being asked. I ran it through the sensor access port. The contact point was at 0.4 thousandths from nominal, inside civilian spec tolerance, inside military spec tolerance for that matter. I put the probe down, ready to close up and run calibration, I said. Verath San looked at me. She had a quality of controlled professional relief that she was managing carefully, but not entirely. "Who assists?" she said. "I don't need anyone. I'll talk you through the calibration sequence, and you can verify from the management system console." She nodded, and we closed up the housing, torqued it to spec, the civilian spec, which I had in my work log, and she went to the console. What followed was 40 minutes of low-power calibration cycling, which is the most boring part of any drive core repair, and is also the most important part. You run the core at fractional power through a series of thermal sequences that are designed to confirm that the sensor is reading accurately across the temperature range it will encounter in normal operation. At each step, Verath San called out the management system sensor reading, and I compared it to my own independent temperature measurement at the housing surface. If the system and my measurement agreed within the tolerance band, we moved to the next step. They agreed on every step. I should say something about what calibration feels like from the inside of a 40-minute procedure being conducted in a bay where an admiral and 6 engineers are standing around watching you. It feels like 40 minutes. The equipment does not care that it has an audience. The thermal sequences run at their own pace regardless of who is watching, and the only thing you can do is read the numbers correctly, call them out clearly, and wait for the next step. This is fine with me. I have always found it easier to work around people who are watching than people who are helping. Verath San was a good calibration partner. She called out the readings the moment they appeared on the console, without editorial commentary, without pauses that communicated uncertainty, and without the habit some people have of reading the number in a tone that says they're not sure it's the right number. She simply read what was there, and I compared it to what I had, and we moved forward. At the 20-minute mark, halfway through the sequence, I became certain that the repair was going to hold. Not provisionally certain, certain. The sensor readings were tracking my independent measurements with a consistency that told me the contact point was seated correctly and the housing geometry was stable. The management system had no reason to see anything except a healthy core running through a standard calibration. I did not say this out loud. There is a superstition among mechanics that announcing a repair is good before it is confirmed is the fastest way to make it go wrong, and I don't believe in superstitions in any formal sense. But I have also been doing this long enough to know that the last 5 minutes of a calibration are not the same as the first 5, and I wasn't going to talk past the finish line. At the end of the calibration sequence, the core management system updated its status from protective shutdown, thermal fault DETCTED, to tertiary bank nominal, ready for operational restart. Verath San read that off the console in a voice that was careful and even, and gave nothing away. I started packing my tool roll. The bay was still quiet, not the constrained quiet it had been when I walked in, a different kind. The kind that happens when something that has been wrong for a long time has just been made right, and nobody quite knows what to do with that yet. One of the engineers, a young man, I thought, though it can be hard to tell with the higher caste Vethani, said, 2 hours and 14 minutes. He was looking at the work log on his station, from first contact to ready status. Nobody responded to this. Admiral Keth pushed off the wall and crossed the bay. He stopped at a distance that was not close, but was not far, the distance of a conversation, not an inspection. "Tell me what you found," he said. Not the summary, he had heard the summary. He meant the whole thing, the path from the theory to the confirmation to the work. I told him. I was brief, because it was not a long story and because the details were either in Varath San's console log or they weren't worth keeping. The civilian spec housing, the thermal warp from the Vel Sarath transit, the shifted sensor, the false overheat reading, the management system doing exactly what it was built to do. The draw pin and the heat lamp. 11 minutes of heating and 3 passes with the pin. The Admiral listened the way he did everything else, completely still, face giving nothing away, entirely present. When I was done, he said, "My engineering team ran 3 full diagnostic cycles." "Military Corps diagnostic parameters," I said, "not civilian." "Yes," a pause. "You identified the housing type in under 3 minutes." "I've been looking at civilian coupler housings for 12 years, I said. "The stamp is different. The surface texture is different. The thermal coating has a different color tone. Once you know what you're looking for, it's fast." My team didn't know what to look for. "Your team was trained on warship cores," I said. "This was a freight corps problem wearing a warship coat. You wouldn't expect them to recognize it." Admiral Keth looked at me for a moment that was long enough to be deliberate. "You were turned away from the Dock 7 checkpoint 2 days ago," he said. "Yes." "You came back when my chief engineer asked." She asked in good faith and explained the situation clearly. That's different from being waved off at a gate. Another measured pause. "What are you paid?" he said. This question took me a moment, because it was more direct than I expected from him. "I have a bay lease rate and a time and materials billing structure," I said. "For an independent consultation job, I invoice at my standard hourly rate plus any consumables." I thought about the heat lamp time and the draw pin wear. "Today, you'd owe me for 3 hours and 40 minutes, plus a nominal consumables charge for the thermal compound and the probe tip." The Admiral did not visibly react to this, but Varath San, behind him, made a very small sound that might have been something other than professional neutrality. 3 hours and 40 minutes, the Admiral said. "Including the walk from my bay," I said. "I'm not going to charge you for transit time, but I'm also not going to be coy about it taking 40 minutes to walk here." He looked at me. I had the sense, as I had had several times during the previous 2 hours, that I was being assessed by someone who was very good at assessing things, not assessed for competence, which he had watched with his own eyes, but assessed for something else. Character, maybe, in the old sense of the word. What a person is made of when you take the professional context away. "Rail Voss," he said. "I have a position in the 7th Fleet Forward Station staff that has been open for 4 months. Senior Dock Technician. The role is technical supervision of the forward station's civilian to military interface bays, the maintenance bays that handle ships like the Sarath when they require non-standard repair work." He paused. "The forward station runs civilian spec and military spec systems side by side. Procurement is efficient enough that the discrepancies are not unusual. We need someone who can see both." I had been expecting something, but not specifically this. I stopped packing my tool roll. "The station is based at Vel Dorath," he continued, "which is a reasonable facility. Quarters are provided. The pay grade is significantly above what you're invoicing me at the moment." He said this without irony. It was a factual statement which I appreciated. The role would be civilian contract, not military rank. You would not be required to wear a uniform or follow a command hierarchy beyond the operational scope of the maintenance program. I looked at my tool roll. I looked at the tertiary core bank of the Vithani Sarath, which was now showing nominal, ready for operational restart on every management system status line. I have 5 bays under lease at Kale Reach, I said. I know, the Admiral said. Chief Engineer San verified your bay registry before she came to find you. I have existing clients, jobs in progress. I have no expectation that you would abandon obligations already undertaken. The position at Vel Dorath would begin at a mutually agreed date. I thought about this. I thought about it in the specific way I think about logistical problems, which is to say, I thought about the pieces that were fixed and the pieces that were movable, and what the arrangement looked like if you shifted the movable ones into the best available configuration. The 5 bays were leasable to someone else. Orvith had mentioned twice that he knew a mechanic on the Tier 3 civilian deck who was looking to expand. The jobs in progress were completable before the end of the month. The 2 freighter owners who had booked me 6 months out were already going to be disappointed. They could be referred to the Tier 3 mechanic. One condition, I said. Admiral Keth waited. I picked up the draw pin and the heat lamp and placed them in their slots in the tool roll. I rolled it closed and tied it. I slung it over my shoulder. I keep my own tool roll, I said. I don't use station-issued equipment for the diagnostic work. I have my own instruments and they are calibrated to my standards, and I am not trading them for whatever the forward station's supply catalog issues. The Admiral looked at the tool roll on my shoulder. The battered, practical, civilian supply thing that had just done what 14 military engineers with 3 days and their full equipment array had not. Agreed, he said. I nodded, then yes. I turned to go, because there was nothing more to say at that moment, and I had a grain hauler and an ore barge and a livestock transport back in my bay that were not going to finish themselves, and Orvith was probably already trying to figure out what had taken me so long. Voss, the Admiral said behind me. I stopped. The 16 supply convoys depart within the hour, he said. The food shipments to Vel Sarath will make their distribution window. I looked back at him. He was standing in the same position he had occupied for most of the past 2 hours still, contained, giving almost nothing away. But there was something different in the way he said it that I think he intended me to hear. Not gratitude exactly. Something more functional and more real than gratitude, the acknowledgement that a thing had been done by someone who had done it, and that the doing of it had mattered. Good, I said. And I walked back to my bay. Orvith was at his supply counter when I passed it, doing what Orvith was always doing, which was 3 things at once, and pretending he was only doing one. He looked up when I went by. How was it, he said. Warped coupler housing on the tertiary bank, I said. Civilian spec running on a military diagnostic. Sensor was reading false overheat. Fixed it with the draw pin and the heat lamp. Orvith looked at me. 2.5 days, he said. 14 engineers. They weren't looking for a freight core problem. And you were. I wasn't looking for anything, I said. I went and looked and saw what was there. He nodded slowly, with the quality of a man deciding that this was sufficient. The Admiral, he said, how was he? I thought about this for a moment. About the moment at the checkpoint when I'd been turned away, and the moment in the bay when the Admiral had looked at the draw pin and the heat lamp, and the choice he had made in the 3 seconds after. About the way he'd stood against the wall and watched for 2 hours without interfering, and without asking to be involved, and without doing any of the things that people in positions of authority sometimes do when they are uncomfortable with not being the one holding the tool. Decent, I said, all things considered. Orvith smiled, which on a Vithani civilian is a very specific thing, a slow deepening of the expression around the eyes, not much in the mouth. He offered you something. How do you know that? Because you were gone for 3.5 hours and you came back walking the same as when you left, which means you aren't flustered, which means whatever he offered you is something you decided to take on your own terms. I stopped at the door to my bay. Senior dock technician, I said, 7th Fleet Forward Station, Vel Dorath. Orvith was quiet for a moment. That's a good posting, he said. I know. You'll be working on military ships. I'll be working on the interface bays, the places where military ships get fixed with civilian equipment because procurement doesn't always match the hardware to the doctrine. I looked at my bay, the grain hauler and the ore barge and the livestock transport with 47 items on its defect list, which is apparently more common than the 7th Armada's engineering program was previously aware of. Are you going to finish the grain hauler first? I'm going to finish all of them first, I said. I told the admiral I had existing obligations. And he accepted that. He accepted everything I said, I told Orvith, and I accepted everything he said and will start when I'm done here. I looked at the grain hauler's mounting plate and the vibration source tracking notes I'd left on the bench, which will take about 3 weeks. 3 weeks, Orvith said. I work at my own pace, I said, which is why people book me 6 months out, or used to. He nodded. I went into my bay and picked up the torque driver. The grain hauler's number 2 traction ring stabilizer array had a micro imbalance that had been there for a long time and had been slowly eating the mounting plate. And someone had replaced the mounting plate 3 times without ever looking for the source of the vibration, which is the kind of thing that makes a freight core mechanic's life long and busy and occasionally exasperating. I found the imbalance. I corrected it. I noted it in the defect log and flagged it for the owner's review. Then I moved on to the next thing. There was, as always, a next thing. There was, as it turned out, always going to be a next thing, just at a different station, in a different bay, with a different assortment of ships that needed someone to look at them and see what was actually there instead of what the standard diagnostic expected to find. The 7th Fleet Forward Station at Vel Dorath had, I learned later, a backlog of interface bay cases that had been sitting unresolved for months because nobody on the station's technical staff had both the civilian corps experience to diagnose them and the military environment access to do anything about it. That, it turned out, was a combination I had been building for 12 years without knowing I was building it. I did not think of it that way at the time. At the time I thought of it as the grain hauler and the stabilizer array, and the ore barge and the field dampener and the livestock transport and the 47 items. And when those were done, I thought of the 5 bays and who was going to take the lease, and what to do about the 2 freighter owners who had been waiting 6 months and deserved a straight explanation rather than a referral. I gave them the straight explanation. They were not pleased, but they were fair about it, the way people are when you're honest with them. One of them asked if I knew anyone as good as me at Vel Dorath Station. I said I didn't know yet. I said I'd find out. The ore barge owner, who had tried to fix his own field dampener, and whose effort I had spent the better part of 4 days untangling, shook my hand at the end of the job with a quality of relief that suggested he had been genuinely afraid I'd found something worse inside. I had not. What I'd found was what I'd expected. An amateur repair piled on top of an amateur repair, each one trying to correct the previous one's consequences, the whole thing resembling a geological record of progressive bad decisions made under time pressure. The underlying fault, beneath all of it, was a worn damper coil that should have been replaced 3 years ago and had been nursed along instead, which was the kind of thing that made a mechanic tired in a specific way. Not angry, just tired. The machine had been trying to tell someone for 3 years. I replaced the coil. I unwound all the amateur work and did it properly. I invoiced him fairly and noted in my records that the ship would need another damper inspection in 18 months. That was 3 weeks before I left the Reach. On my last morning in my bay, Orvith brought the tonic again and we stood at the supply counter and drank it, looking at the observation windows and the empty dock face where the Vethani Sareth had sat for 3 days and was now gone, back on patrol with the rest of the 7th Armada, 6 days late and not a day later. "You'll be good at it," Orvith said. "I'll be the same as I always am," I said, "which is what I was here." "That's what I mean," he said. I finished the tonic. I picked up my tool roll because I had not checked it into any luggage and was not going to, and I walked out of the bay and down the corridor and caught the transit for Vel Dorath. I am sitting in the forward station's interface bay office writing this now, which I was asked to do by Admiral Keth's staff as part of what they call an operational lessons learned review, meaning they want a record of how the Sareth's fault was found and what the diagnostic failure was and what the repair required, so that the engineering program can update its procedures. I have written that part in the technical addendum to this document. This is the rest of it. I will say this much, because the person who asked me to write it up suggested that the account should be complete rather than just technical. There is a particular kind of problem that develops when a very large and very professional organization becomes so specialized in its own domain that it stops being able to see the problems that live at the edges. The Vethani Military Drive Corps engineering program is excellent at what it does. Its diagnostic procedures are rigorous, and its technicians are well trained, and its maintenance record, across the fleet, is one of the best in the Reach. The problem was not that they were bad at their jobs. The problem was that they were very, very good at a specific version of their jobs, and the Vel Sareth refit had quietly introduced a component that didn't belong to that version. Nobody is bad at their job for not knowing what they don't know. But you need someone at the edge who knows both sides of it, and you need to let her through the checkpoint when she shows up. I came through the checkpoint because a chief engineer was willing to review the log and ask a follow-up question and show up at a civilian bay on Tier 2 and have a direct conversation with a person she had never met. And I came through the checkpoint because an admiral, in a moment when his professional judgment was under pressure, was willing to step back from the edge of a decision he'd already made and let the work show him what the work showed him. I have fixed a lot of cores. Some of them were more complicated than the Sareth's tertiary bank, many of them were less. But I will say that the Sareth was the first one I fixed with an admiral standing 15 feet away watching every move, which is a different working condition than I am accustomed to. And I will also say that he was the quietest, most out-of-the-way admiral I can imagine, and that I don't know how much that cost him in a room full of his own engineers, but I think it cost him something, and I think he paid it without hesitation, and that is worth noting. That is the end of the operational account. The technical addendum follows. The draw pin and the heat lamp are still in my tool roll, in their slots. They will stay there.